Thanks everyone for coming out this afternoon. The presentation I wanted to make today for our discussion has to do our seminar on the speculative megastructures, we could call them, is to emphasize the speculative side of this question and what the relationship between speculation and design might be, both in terms of the kinds of subgenres and discourses that we recognize under the rubric speculative design, and others, particularly in relationship to perhaps speculative realism and the various flavors and species of this, some of which might be understood as having the project of attempting to re-enchant the world, others the project to further disenchant the world, and where the connections between the kind of speculative design that we may be interested in, starting with and departing from architecture, may relate to those projects. It's also a topic that's on my mind recently because of the launch of the speculative design undergraduate major at UC San Diego. And so we had a launch event for that recently, and my remarks here today are a kind of revision of some of the thoughts that I presented there as well, that are more specifically tailored to our consideration here. So that's what we're going to be on about. It'll be much shorter than the last presentation. We'll go for about an hour, hopefully a little bit of time for some discussion, and then we'll look forward to seeing some of the work that we're developing in the seminar. So the first thing I wanted to sort of put on the table with the subtitle of When and Where, which, as you'll see, refers to the question of the temporal and spatial scale of the site condition into which a design might intervene. How big is this? How long is something supposed to be there for? How long would it be used for? What is the scope of the different flows and networks to which it might be connected? And the importance of understanding that, as I'll try to argue, from a kind of non-intuitive, non-anthropometric perspective. In the more prosaic sense, the where of the design discussion we're having is here in Los Angeles and in California. And so I suppose to start with, we could argue that to some extent the discussion around design and speculation, or speculative design in any sort of sense, in California we could be forgiven of seeing this as a somewhat redundant, somewhat of a redundancy. What other kind of design would California possibly do, of course? So California, as we know, is not only the sixth largest economy in the world by itself. It goes up and down. Sometimes it's as high as 4, sometimes it's as low as 11th. It sort of depends on the ebbs and flows of various things, but roughly the same size as the economies of South Korea and France by itself. It's the home, as we know, of these global entertainment and software industries. It's a capital region of Euro-American, Pacific Rim, and Latin American cultural flows, among many others, and is even accused, particularly in digital media and software and politics circles, of having its own techno-political dogma, sometimes known as the California ideology. In other words, isn't California design always speculative in one way or another, all the way back to the days when, as I had mentioned, I think previously, European explorers had rendered the California Peninsula as an island. This is a map from the a Dutch map from the 1700s, an island separate from the mainland. And so for our discussion of the megastructure as a withdrawn, closed-loop utopia, we pay attention to these things. Through the waves of various Californian visionaries and crackpots who have built a stream of utopian communities and platforms here, from Kenneth Anger to Walt Disney to Sutter's Mill, Google, Gaylord Wilshire, very strange character, jet propulsion labs and so on. Islands, as we know, are where prototype worlds are modeled and set in motion. And so per Frederick Jameson on utopian literature and politics and Dr. Moreau on utopian medicine and biology, we could perhaps surmise that in some ways, in important ways, these map makers who drew California as an island were not entirely wrong. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think we want to sort of have as a point for our discussion is exactly which kind of design we're talking about here, and which in its relationship to the speculative and to speculation in general. Of recently, and both in terms of the sort of more formal discourse around speculative design, the emergent genres or perspectives are often asked to differentiate themselves, their goals and methods, from what we might recognize as normal or regular design. And sometimes they'll do so and make these distinctions without being prompt. In some respects, the speculative design discourse understands itself as an alternative to, as an alternative and more progressive perspective, adjacent to more mainstream design culture, and also as an alternative to other alternatives. And so, while some might question speculative design's ultimate value in compared to other types of alternatives like critical design, participatory design, and so forth, we will take another tack. But partisans of those perspectives, I think, are right to see that their own presumptions are not always so aligned with speculative design in this way. So, one of the ways in which speculative design has tended to be structured, or has tried to sort of make some of these differentiations, has been by the sort of compare and contrast, the A-B list being a useful method, or at least a common one in this regard. And so part of the ways in we want to think about the relationship between design and speculation, not only in terms of the designs of things as we normally understand them, widgets, withdrawn or non-withdrawn objects, manifest subjectivities, formal forms, but also designing the relations between them, systems and supply chains and encounters and obligations and accounting protocols and so on. These distinctions may prove useful to us. So, part of it also is because we recognize that, contrary to what you might read in Business Week or in the last IDEO bestseller, design thinking is not some magical force that makes involving stick-up notes and colored beanbags that immediately makes everything better. It's also something that structures and aestheticizes and makes more plausible and delightful pathological relationships to material culture. And so, for reasons that are more perhaps a matter of practical survival, other paths are required. Again, systems of objects. So one of the A-B lists we may want to consider for this discussion, is, at least from the speculative design discourse, one of the is Dunn and Raby's, that's Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby now at Parsons, A-B list from their, also republished in their Speculative Everything. The A column here representing what they take to be normal or normative design, the B list being the critical alternative that they wish to propose. So the way to read this is a kind of from and to. Instead of affirmative design, it's critical design. Instead of design for consumers, it's designed for citizens, from users to person, training to education, so forth and so on. Now, there's certainly a lot to debate about the design for debate model that they propose here, but we're going to sort of take the bait and run with it as well. I also think that it's, for those with a somewhat more historical perspective, it's interesting to compare the Dunn and Raby A-B list with the A-B list from Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto from 1985, in which she makes a similar kind of, uses the same kind of technique to make a differentiation between what she takes to be, using the parlance of the times of 1985, from a modern to postmodern structures, from representation to simulation, from the public and private dynamic to a cyborg citizenship, cooperation to communications enhancement, so forth and so on. It's interesting also, if we wanted to, I think it would be a useful exercise to be done in some way to if not directly superimpose, at least compare these two lists one to another. They don't line up exactly, but the ways in which that they both inform and deform one another might be quite useful to think about exactly what the means and ends are, and the conditions by which they may leverage themselves for a interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary design practice, and the value of that transdisciplinarity I want to speak to in a moment. We should also say, is that we use this technique as a part of the way to sort of think about what we were going to be doing with the speculative design major at UCSD, the kinds of structures we this as well, and in the class that I do, where we're working with on the development of practices, I encourage students to use this device in their own way and towards their own ends. It should also be said, though, that pretty much anywhere else in the world, if you talk about A-B modeling, it doesn't refer to a kind of index of deliberately and pre-configured, pre-understood pathways by which something might act. It refers to a kind of automation of alternatives. They both have to do with searching the space of alternatives. One has to do with a kind of deliberate and predetermined structuring for it, and the other one is a sort of again, as I say, a sort of automation and structure of this. For example, Google A/B testing, where you figure out which ad will work. I mean, any advertising A/B testing, but the Google A/B testing one you may perhaps be more familiar with. Instead of a designer figuring out exactly by creative intuition what the most appropriate solution for this would be, you try all of them and you essentially test them in the real world, and the one that actually proves to have the results that you want will work. So basically, it's a certain kind of has certain obvious parallels to deep learning methodologies, where instead of trying to decide in advance what the model might be that would be the most successful, you sort of set it go, and certain kinds of evolutionary processes that work, the solution will find itself. Now, I think there's something to be, I think there's probably a bit more to be learned here, or at least interpreted from this distinction than it might first appear. And I think for us, the key idea of this, in terms of that point by which design turns into designation, actually determining systems, is where this becomes most salient. And that is the question the point by which, on the one hand, some kind of deliberate and predetermined configuration of an outcome is the predicate by which the practice develops itself, and on the other hand, the modes by which the design itself and the capacity for that design to operate and interact with the world, separate from and even increasingly untethered from the specific authorial attentions of the designer, and to understand this not as some kind of exception to the rule or some sort of space by which design escapes its true master, but as the basis by which the composition of systems at whatever scale may wish and should always find certain kinds of outcomes. Particularly because if we assume that the types of systems and structures that we wish to design, or the types of outcomes that we wish our designs to enable, to put it more specifically, very well may be ones that we cannot conceptualize entirely in advance. In the same way, it can't be that the designer would know that its advertising B is going to be the one that's going to have the most efficacy in a certain sort of way, and for reasons why it's the most effective may not ever know. We don't necessarily need to know it. You just need to know that it works in a certain way. That the capacity to set systems up and to set them in motion such that the outcomes solve themselves, or that they're able to find an outcome, to search the space of possibilities to come to an outcome that we want, regardless of the homology or correspondence between the authorial intention and the outcome, is a strategy to be championed, not one to be held in suspicion. That is, or put differently, the prevalence of such techniques for the modeling of ideal options, of risk patterns, plotted outcomes, underscores that, as well, that what we call speculation is not some additional, supplemental, or marginal process in our economy, as I think I mentioned previously. Whether or not we speak of this for commodities, equities, futures, enterprise reinsurance, weather forecasting, the global economy, the real global economy, functions by speculative models of the real and long-term future. The speculative is in relationship to the designation of systems, of which designers have supposedly some expert role to play, is then less understood as some airy-fairy kind of imaginative space of pure and unadulterated imagination than it is a matter of nuts and bolts. So better than, and I think better than concluding that, as some might, that because it is, in fact, speculation is an infrastructural process and not something that is adjacent to or supplemental to those processes, that the future itself is somehow already lost to empire, to the moderns, to some other sort of space, some other captured domain, and needs to be resisted in some way. But rather, I think the purpose is that to set model making as a whole to the task of the searching of the space of actual possibilities that we can't anticipate in advance, particularly ones that are would be outside those our normal capacities to conceive them and to realize them under other circumstances. Okay, so I want to then talk a little bit about then this question of scale, again, to the when and the where, and particularly in terms of spatial scale, of which our megastructures maybe have a particular position, but more particularly in terms of time and the duration of the site condition by which we might be interested in intervening, and particularly in terms of what we might commonly call the future. For reasons that are not so obscure, the types of projects and the types of practices and discourses that are organized into and around speculative design, and those that are organized around the notion of design futures, of designing the future of this, the future of that, some kind of speculative future for this, whatever it is, the future of food, the future of housing, the future of clothing, the future of banking, the future of money, the future of whatever you like. There's a presumption that there is a kind of overlap between these two perspectives, and in many cases there is. But as I've said in other contexts, and I think in some ways in our culture, speaking of the future is a way in which we say things about the present that would otherwise be rude or somehow untoward or unspeakable. But in some ways, it's also a way of saying absolutely nothing at all. It's a way of deferring difficult thinking and difficult decisions into some kind of once upon a time, in this case, and once upon a future time, in which the things that would get in the way of the more direct decisions are somehow bracketed from our conversation. So I think part of the reason for this is that there's and so what I would rather sort of focus us, the argument that I'll try to focus us toward with this is that we want to think about a kind of a sort of matrix, if you like, of spatial and temporal scales by which a site condition might organize itself. So the small, medium, large, and extra large model of something that is very close and immediate to us, like the button that a user might push, to something that of the scale of a structure, to an urban condition, to a continental or transcontinental system. And another axis of this matrix of an immediate, something that is designed for an immediate reaction. If you're floating, if you're left stranded floating in the Pacific Ocean and you're going to find something and to make it into a raft that you can float on, you are solving for an immediate your immediate problem. If you're designing something that is meant to have a duration of an entire generation or 2 generations, you may be designing for a much longer term problem. We can think of a kind of matrix between the immediate spatial scale and an immediate to large spatial scale and immediate to long-term temporal scale. Now, our initial presumption would be, for reasons that are not so unusual, so I'm asking you to imagine this sort of 4-square matrix. We might imagine, for reasons that are not so peculiar, that the things that are meant to be very large scale in terms of their spatial scale and the things that are meant to have a very long duration may have some kind of homology. Right? We don't normally think of things that are instantaneous temporally having being very, very large, or things that are very, very tiny being things that last a very long time. It's usually the idea that if it's going to last a long time, it's sort of large, that there's some correspondence between this. But there's no reason for this necessarily to be this way. It's just as possible to understand these sort of the correspondences work in that the inverse to what we might think to be the intuition in this regard. Things that are very, very small, that have a tremendously long duration, things that have a tremendously short duration that are in fact very large. And how it is that you understand the position from which your practice would intervene towards the condition of a projection of a solution to whatever it is, the structure of the problem to which it's been posed, can be understood, sliced and diced in many different ways according to this structure, to the matrix. And so the one that I would sort of advocate for, at least in this conversation that was had today, is towards the longer duration as the condition by which some of these things maybe sort of work it out. Now, I think part of the conundrum or part of the bad rap that notions of the future and design future might have within a critical design studies, part of it has to do with watching a lot of just really horrible corporate branding videos about Microsoft's future of the home, or Motorola's future of the car, or Apple's future of this or something, blah, blah, these kinds of things, where we have these sickeningly fragile resolutions of what are supposed to be universal kinds of consumer wants and needs, but appear to very quickly as something that's really quite specific and unbelievable and instantaneously stale in their imagination of how things might go. The future is presented to us, the entirety of the future itself is presented to us, not as it might have been, say, in the World's Fair of 1964, as this in New York, as these sort of vast vistas of new and more intelligent infrastructures by which our capacities for collective reason would have allowed us to master the means of production in new and more rational and amazing ways. The future is a place in which interfaces are slightly more delightful, where there's perhaps a bit more parking, where homes turn the lights on and off in a different sort of time. Instead of, we've gone from the notion of the future has shifted from going to the moon, going to Mars, to more parking. Part of also, I think, the unbelievability of the types of futures, or the problem of the way in which we just think about the future in these sorts of regards, is that there's a confusion between the temporalities or the structures of these futures. And then that is, we could think of a social future, a technological future, an infrastructural future, and a geologic future. That is, the social future is more or less like what is lunch going to be like in 10 years, a relatively sort of culturally specific kind of problem. On the other end of the spectrum, we might think of the geologic futures of how it, from the heat death of the universe back to what happens as our Anthropocenic predicament becomes more less friendly to the continuing development of the types of industrial civilizations that we put forth. In other words, I think that there's part of the pathology and of the ways in which the future has been brought into a design discourse is based on the presumption that there's an immediate and should be an immediate correspondence between an understanding of the social future and a technical or geologic future. The idea that how it is that a society understands its own place in history and how it is that the actual systems in which and upon which that society is perched and predicated as being things that should correspond to that society's understanding of its own history is a bizarre form of collective solipsism. It's not just sort of anthropocentrism. It's a desire and a demand that the world should work according to the way in which we understand at a particular point in time ourselves to work. And what we want to do then is to further this, is to exacerbate and to become a bit demystified about this, the discomfort that untethering one of these from each other allows for us. And so the way in which we could sort of put it, let me put this a bit differently. If we think of this matrix of scale between the very short term and the very long term, or the very small and the very large, in this matrix, each of the temporal scales from the immediate to the long term has its own version of the future. It has its own logic of what futurity would even mean. Is it measured in minutes? Is it measured in centuries? There is a social future, as I say, measured with the attendant duration that's measured in fashion cycles or the communal memory of place, what used to be there on that corner. A technical future with its cycles of product releases and own sort of mechanical and machinic evolution. An historical future of transgenerational undulations of friend and enemy. We used to be at war with this country, now we're at war with that country. What did it used to be like? Where did this sort of site come from? Where did this community come from, and how do we memorialize this? And a geologic future with its ripples and rhythms that span far longer than the genomic coherency of any one apex species. Now, as I say, I would argue that any affective sense of order by which those futural forms is somehow thought to be in some special harmony, that the geologic future is in sync with the social future in some way, or historical future in sync with the technical future, is to the extent to which we might feel that at a moment, it's surely not is being felt is not some organic sense of the order of things, but a kind of sophistic illusion. It takes a special kind of anthropocentric naivete to fully entertain the idea that, for example, making all design human scale would be a long-term solution to anything but the most pedestrian of problems. The futures worth designing, to make the point, are probably those that exceed human phenomenology's intuitive scales of anatomically embedded spatial navigation, our own sense of how far something is, how big something is, how far away it is, that in a Vitruvian man kind of ergonomic sense, and or the temporalities of an organism's lifespan. 100 years is a long time in a design structure, because this is the relative structure of the lifespan of the client organism, not the lifespan or the effective performance or the sort of span of performance of the system or object that is in fact being designed or designated into existence. So I think it is important to mobilize speculation and design on behalf of conditions that are not yet existing, some kind of future, but not for the purposes of relinking a social history or society sense of its own history as a kind of mooring privilege. It's exactly it's the systems and things that and objects that we would want to design that I argue exceed that, our sense of human-centric space and human-centric time. That is the space where the future can in fact be once again a kind of productive conversation. All right, so specifically then, what does design look like in this sort of regard? Certainly, there's a whole history of modern design that takes on questions like this, and has taken them on as some of the core foundations. So the question then can be posed, I think, in terms of this sort of quick sort of scan of design history in regard of this, at least in two directions. One is how it is that similar kind of understanding has been found within a history of design, of modern design, and also how it is that perspective may in fact ask us to rehistoricize modern design from a different perspective. That different perspective, which I would put forth, is a kind of as I mentioned, I think previously, is a kind of radical materialism. And by materialism, I don't just mean historical materialism or something like this, but I mean really matter, chemistry, molecules. And so the argument that I would want to put forth in terms of this question of how this perspective of a deepening of time, of the temporal and spatial scales, or a de-anthropomorphizing and de-anthropometricizing of the temporal and spatial scale, in terms of that attention to the capacities, the technical and compositional capacities of matter, and how that would ask us to rethink about design, I think is actually quite is already at hand in a certain way. What Rainer Banham called the first machine age, is and its arc within the history and as the basis of modern design. Was arguably a moment in which new forms of material became available to a design imaginary. Plastics, cheap steels and metals, fabrication, replication and fabrication, printing, stamping, shipping, molding, modeling. But in this sense, chemistry, as much as economics, though in some ways the two are probably hard to differentiate, would drive the anthropology of this particular form of culture. Because we had, in other words, to state it as plainly as I can, because cheap metals and plastics and the capacity to replicate, and the capacity and the means to replicate these to replicate copies and to stack and to ship and distribute these became possible, it was not only the condition for design at this moment was not only that one could make objects that previously had not been made before, but in the image of those objects that hadn't been made before, one could design and designate a new social organization in relationship to the material culture that would hold that society together. And so from the new capacities for substance, forms of matter, plastic and metal and being designable, new kinds of systems for the fabrication and distribution of the objects became possible. And in the image of those fabrication, distribution objects, new forms of a mass society were understood and imagined and to a certain extent brought to being. All of this is part of the plan for the Bauhaus, for example, or in other forms of modern design. What I want to point our attention back to in this way is this material basis by which this idea of a mass society organized around these material capacities was possible to think in the first place. And in this way, these are some of Mendelev's early table of the elements. It's a periodic table of elements, right? Because periodically updated, could be understood as the kind of alphabet for the composition of these modern substances and the conjugation of their forms. And then as for design and disciplinarity, as techniques for this fabrication of these objects and scales became in themselves schools of thought, design forms became fixed at different levels of implementation. Type and image, shelter, apparatus, transportation, etc. Thus, modern design education would coalesce around corresponding expertise in graphic design, industrial design, interaction design, architectural design, and so forth. What held these together in a certain way was still this new material capacity for a recomposition. Different tools and techniques for that composition would coalesce into different disciplines as scales. And so part of the argument I would sort of to make, certainly one that can be contended, is that part of the doxic modern disciplinary distinction within forms of design, obviously around scales, is also has its origin to a certain extent is in the pedagogy and education around skill sets for the fabrication of using the capacities of modern chemistry for the fabrication of objects at different scales, which require different tools and the expertise in those different tools, and the professionalization of those different fields would result in the kinds of disciplines that are, in essence, that are arbitrary in both senses of the term. That is, both that they arbitrate and decide those distinctions based on the field, the practical and professional field distinctions, but also in a certain sense mutable, capricious. Now, and the interesting thing, we also want. I'm going to sort of bracket an aside here, right in the middle of it as well. The other thing I think we want to also, so again, take this now with big open parentheses right now. Another thing I think is very important to hold in mind in terms of this question of the speculative within design, sort of as a methodology here as well. And I want to sort of, again, I introduce this here in order to underscore the point that this fact is not in any way is not something that's appeared very recently. Is to have an attention to and respect for the, I guess you could say, the non-linearity of cause and effect between a particular kind of, a particular authorial intention within a design projection and the ultimate structures and reverberations of its outcomes. For example, it's the keeping the ambiguity open that becomes part of a methodological ethics. These are, for example, some of the drawings from Alexander Graham Bell's telephones, 1874. There's other people who were part of the invention of the telephone and this as well, but these are some of Graham Bell's. So those of you read Mark Wigley's Network Fever, he makes this point, and he draws this out as well. Graham Bell, a little bit less known, though probably well known here at SCI-Arc, was also one of the inventors, or innovators at least, of the space frame systems, which for him was of interest as a structure, but his real passion for space frames was to make kites, not to make necessarily buildings with them. And so he had these sort of great space frame kites, which you're welcome to build and fly today. They work quite well. So interesting, the same guy who makes the telephone network also makes this canonical form of a network architecture. Again, we're all familiar with this from Wigley's piece. Conrad Wichmann began to develop this basic, sort of scale the basic structure into a kind of megastructural scale and scope because of the basic sort of isomorphic building block of the space frame architecture. It can scale essentially infinitely. Buckminster Fuller begins to unfold this and to develop this and to sort of understand how it is that this basic, the geometry of the space frame could be used for alternate topologies, and by the inverse, the way in which space frame topologies could be used for altered geometries, and resulting, as we know, in the geodesic dome, in essence, a spherical space frame, and begin to now back to the area of the megastructure, his speculative proposals for a dome over Manhattan, unbuilt, unrealized, as you may know. And a little bit later, as we discussed in the previous discussion, or in the same era of the Apollo moonrise images, and the comprehension of an increase in the comprehension of what the baseline spatial scale of the site condition by which an architectural intervention might take place. We see this corresponding series of what we now take to be the kind of canonical experimental megastructures, many of which are themselves extrapolations of Bell's kites and structures, Kenzo Tange and the metabolists in the plan for Tokyo Bay. Of course, continuous monument, most obviously in terms of the logic of scaffolding space frames, Plug-in City, or some of the later drawings for No-Stop City, which take the logic of an infinite replication of nodal points within a grid, rotated and stacked as the basic structure for the No-Stop City project, and this as well. And then, of course, finally, our own version of No-Stop City multiplied times continuous monument plus Plug-in City plus all the rest of it, which the internet itself We are roughly there where the blue dot is as well. And the moral of the story basically being is that sometimes you think you're designing a kite and you end up making 4chan. And it is the unpredictability of those outcomes that we want to hold close to our heart, not as something to be exposed and purified out of the process, but is taken as the basis of the process itself. Okay, now, to our moment, the argument I would want to make is that like that of the early 20th century and the emergence of modern design, in relationship to this new material palette of plastics and metals and the rest of this, we are also we're also confronted with another kind of new matter forms that are available to and invite kinds of design. Just for in the most summary possible sense, we'll speak of things, Internet of Things, robotics and AI, 3D printing, and biotechnology sort of among these, but we certainly can speak to sort of more of these as well. And the argument that we assume is that we put forward is that just as previously, when the appearance and possibility of these new forms of material substance and material composition structured the disciplinary and projective logic and design in their own image, so too are the forms of matter and substance that we have before us now, and also the capacity for them to, in doing so, to provoke and demand an understanding of variations within a material culture that would reorganize an entire social organization in their own image. And so we should presume in many ways that the kinds of, among other things, that the distinctions between the modern sub-disciplines within design that had been organized around a particular competency in the design for particular scales and outcomes in the use of previous matter, of which this august institution is one example of those distinctions, is in a process of almost inevitable reorganization around the capacities of the matter and materials with which we now have in front of us. The questions of temporal and spatial distinction don't disappear, but the matter that would be organized in relationship to those tempos of scale and space do alter themselves. Is that clear? Okay. So among these, obviously, are, as we've discussed, what we might call human-artificial intelligence interaction, which we assume may illuminate unexpected forms of empathy and intelligence and identity, not just in the image of human vanity, but how is it that we will midwife robotics and synthetic embodiment as they themselves speciate or parallel and incorporate with other existing animal bodies at what forms and scale. We should assume also, I think, that the way in which emergent forms of AI will embody the world with us are not ones that that only exist at the level of the graphical user interface, like in Jeff McFetrich's design for Her, or an anthropomorphic robot that might talk to us, or Morgan Freeman's voice on Waze, or something that appears to us as if it was a synthetic human. But that the kinds of embodiment that AI is has the capacity to take on, and very likely does not and cannot possibly match up against the kind of the organism, genus, phylum, the organism, species, genus, phylum logic and distinction that our own species has developed. And so the capacity for an intelligence to exist at an urban scale, at a building scale, at a continental scale, at an object scale, at a sub-object scale, or in multiples at the same time in a distributed sort of way, explodes again the structure of both the temporal and spatial scale of exactly where the site for the design of this might in fact be. What's of interest to me, among other things, about the Jones's film, in terms of this as well, not only in terms of the capacity for the single intelligence to interact with multiples of these at the same time, but the way in which this interest in a particular frontier within in AI research, where increasingly human-computer interaction design becomes about personality design. and the design not just of buttons with words on them or means by which, recomposing the mental models by which a user would hunt and poke their way through a website, but rather in the composition of personalities in which they might invest their own interests, intentions, and desires, in which those personalities themselves become part of a kind of habitat for them. What we take to be Internet of Things, I think, is a sort of horrible term in terms of this tells us nothing about what the Internet is or what things are. But let's say algorithmic ubiquitous computation introduces forms of algorithmic calculation, as I've said, from a molecular scale up to a landscape scale, seeds communications to and from objects below or at the normal human scale of encounter. It's not just what does my refrigerator want to say to my toothbrush, but what do things that you could see with a microscope say to things that you can only see with a telescope? And so these these assemblages at various, from urban and continental scale perhaps, may flow into and out of our lines of sight, lines of sound, capacities for sound or touch. They may undulate beyond our capacities to perceive them, or they may require forms of our own sensory augmentation even to see them and perceive them in the first place. And in doing so, how do these maps become images? How do these maps become territories, and in turn, how do those territories that they compose and striate become themselves maps? Thus, synthetic biology, various kinds of, and which we could describe. We will define. Casey and I were talking about this a little bit earlier before. There's a few different ways in which the connotation of synthetic biology might be taken. I've learned from being down in La Jolla, where there's a rather vibrant biotech industry, that to some extent synthetic biology is understood as a kind of it's biotech when the basic terms and kit of parts for doing really simple things that we've more or less understood how to do for quite some time get turned into a sort of standard kit of tools that people without particularly sophisticated laboratory training might actually be able to develop. This is a still from the BioBricks project. Drew Edney at Stanford was one of the participants in an interesting project sponsored by iGen, Cambridge University, and some other ones who were involved, called Synthetic Aesthetics, where biotechnologists and artists and designers were brought together for a period of time to use this system that Edney and some others had developed called BioBricks, by which these sort of Lego kinds of structures could be organized and stacked and put together in different sorts of ways. And so the things that we might know about what a particular string of DNA, whatever particular gene would actually be able to do, you could compose a more complex strings of DNA in order to make introduce those capacities into the kinds of systems that we have ourselves. Now, from the standpoint of the more professional biotechnologists, all of this is really kind of dumb and simple. From what's of interest to us about this is the way in which this becomes. It's kind of, for a biotech, this is kind of like SketchUp. It's about it's a kind of child's level designing tool. But in a way, that's what makes it, in certain ways, most interesting, in that it's something that you actually have the capacities for the redesigning of not just the living matter. With cooking, and we've been redesigning the chemistry of living matter for quite some time, but redesigning the capacities and affordances of still living organisms to ask them to do things in different sort of ways, including ourselves. And ultimately, I think this is of course the more fraught philosophical problematic, is that instead of the kind of Vitruvian model of human as being both the measure and the agent of design, and the world out there being the thing upon which always he, introduces his intention, that the human itself, literally at the level of the organic matter out of which that organism and species is composed, itself becomes something that can be redesigned, not just in expert laboratories, but at the level of a general design discipline. Our relationship to matter becomes quite different, as I think we've sort of discussed. So some of the outcomes of these projects. This is from some of the Dunn and Raby design interactions project when they were at RCA on this as well. I mean, on the redesign of the human itself, one of the things I think is always important to keep in mind, and one of the things I do appreciate about Dunn and Raby's work in this area is the way in which it gives such cautious attention to this, is that there is a tendency, I think, within our discussions around biotechnology to focus on a certain logic of performative fitness, that we might be able to, we could design algae that eats more CO2, we could design liver cells that are more alcohol resistant or whatever to do, that there's a focus on a particular kind of functional fitness in relationship to what we might take to be the selection pressures on that organism that might otherwise develop it around. But a book that I strongly recommend anyone of real interest in history of biology to read is Darwin's, not Origin of Species, but Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, which is his Origin of Species is the book on natural selection. This is the book on sexual selection. There's at least two ways in which organisms have evolved in order to, as a sort of strategy for replication. One is to be faster or stronger or more camouflaged in relationship to the predators, and the other one is to make themselves more interesting to their own species in some way. The ways in which these kinds of, and of course we do this all the time, in the ways in which we redesign our bodies for different kinds of display, but the capacities for these kinds of technologies to be used not for the former form of a kind of synthetic biology, but the synthetic biology that points towards the latter is probably of more particular interest to of an institution like this. Lucy McRae's work, I think, being a fantastic example of the kind of stuff that we might want to anticipate. There's also something what we said about the question of skin within this. As I think I've mentioned, one of the research areas that we're particularly interested in is that of synthetic skins, both in terms of, this is a skin that was actually sort of grown from this sort of this as well. This is a different kind of vacantes in the mouse. These animals, I'm going to skip through some of these guys. But skin that is focused on this is a, I can't remember if I showed this picture. So this is a project by Laura Splain, which are these pillows. They're just regular pillows that have the cotton of which she took high-resolution scans of her own skin and then printed that onto the cotton of the pillows. But when you hold them in your hand, and they're just regular pillows, you might get it from Target or whatever. You hold them in your hand, you have in your arm, you have this very different relationship to the object than you might have otherwise, as you might well imagine. This as well. Just to sort of quickly go through some of these other, just to sort of on the topic here. These are sort of, I'm sort of a quick survey of some of the more well-known, some of the, I suppose now canonical synthetic biology, biotech projects within speculative design discourse. The pig wings tissue culture project, now probably 15 years old or so now. Oren and Yona cats, which basically what they took is the stem cells from, the phrase when pigs fly. So what they took this stem cells of pigs, cultured them in a cell culturing in a sort of little solution, and essentially grew the cells into this sort of along this very fine biopolymer mesh, sort of like ivy growing in a lattice. And as the cells replicated, as they sort of grew around, they ended up with these 2-inch by 2-inch pig wings. And this is, again, from quite some time ago. But of course, the provocation here, among other things, is the, if you can do this at 2 inches by 2 inches, why not, later 2 feet by 2 feet, 20 feet by 20 feet? At a certain point that you begin to grow these kinds of flesh systems at architectural and urban scale, perhaps. I'm going to skip a discussion of Natalia Edenmont, for example, for this as well. There's something to be said. There's probably a whole other lecture in here to be done on some of these positions of the animal within the biotech discourse and the way in which it might relate up to more literary understandings of the chimera, the hybrid monster, like the minotaur, and so forth, and how it is that what is to be done, let's say, about the durability of a kind of Noah's Ark logic of relationship of organism and species. The idea that an understanding, whether it's implicit or explicit, that there are certain kinds of biological, that species. How do I put this? The idea that the species distinctions are actually somehow real, somehow fixed, somehow structured, such that by the mixing and matching or the swapping or somehow some sort of promiscuity across those kinds of species becomes itself the basis of a monstrous form, something that is not only undesirable but dangerous, risky, a symbol of some kind of evil or unease or disturbance. What do we make of that sort of cultural tradition of the chimera, of the monster, of the hybrid as a monster, in light of a more contemporary understanding of the way in which DNA and genes work? We know that the same basic amino acid building blocks in our DNA are the same ones that are in trees and platypus and oranges and apricots and everything else. It's just a different sort of composition of the same basic recipes in this way as well. Is there a corollary tradition by which that continuity is understood as a basis, such that variations with it are not understood as being monstrous in this way? So just because you'll ask, this is a very old picture. This is quite some time ago. Joseph Vacanti is a doctor in Boston, grew an ear under the skin of this mouse, so that it would grow the vascular system, all the veins and blood and all the rest of the stuff would grow around the tissue within this as well. It's then removed from the mouse, who survived. The mouse was totally fine, and then stuck on the side of transplanted on the side of the person's head here as well. All of which is just, maybe the sort of the simplest point to be made here is that a more demystified understanding of the capacities of biochemistry as a form of matter and its composability, recomposability, would be ones that would almost by necessity lead us to paths by which we would perforate a kind of given logic of organismic form in such ways that we would be certain to produce things that would have the kind of the cultural resonance of some kind of monstrosity. What we do with those monsters is a different question. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to there's another parentheses, was also to think about this question of skin being the point where the organism, the membrane point by which the organism is held together, and it has its own discreteness in its own relationship to the world, obviously. And as we've discussed, our skin is our largest sensory organ, obviously, but we haven't done particularly as much to augment that and mediatize it. And as I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture, there's a lot of very interesting work in epidermal sensors and bio-nanoelectronics that would allow for the mediatization of the skin both as a sensory mechanism to sense things that are going on inside the body that hadn't been able to sense before, to sense things about the outside world that we're not normally able to sense, but also to an interweaving of the mechanical and natural, machine sensing and natural sensation at a scale by which it's impossible ultimately to distinguish what is a natural sensation from what's a machine sensing, such that it's theoretically possible that we can design and compose forms of physical sensation that we've never felt before, in the same way that cinema allowed for the design of sights, images, visions that we had never been able to see before, like slow motion and montage. what it is that we may be able to feel if we could design what feeling is like becomes a basics of this as well. Machine vision and stuff with this. We talked a bit about deep dream here as well. I mean, part of what's really interesting to me about the deep dream system, Google's this machine vision thing that Google released about a year ago, based on a object recognition algorithm that was set to try to find dogs in buildings primarily in objects. And that if you give it a set of images, it will, and you feed it, and you have it run essentially a kind of find edges function on those images, and then try to re-look for the dogs in the buildings again, and then redo the find edges, and continuing sort of this loop, it will eventually find the dogs in the picture with this as well. And as I think I had discussed, part of what's of interest to me about the deep dream is this apophenic logic. Apophenia being the way in which we see patterns that aren't actually there. We perceive patterns that aren't actually there. Like, seeing faces in a cloud is a kind of pareidolia, is a kind of apophenia. That the pattern recognition capacities of our species were an important part of our own evolutionary success, and the fact that AI has reached this plateau by which it's also capable of these kinds of advanced apophenia may be an important part of its own evolution as well. We have this kind of high-resolution scanning and sensing allows us to perceive properties of physical matter at a scale and precision otherwise inconceivable, making some kinds of metaphysical arguments about objects in ontology instantly moot. How would a textile culture predicated on this telescoping and microscoping of physical aesthetics affect all of the above, from epidermal media to synthetic biology? And I guess it's this point, as I make this point, it would be useful to, there's a distinction I would want to make between this kind of, and it's one that requires a bit further development, but one that I would want to make between this kind of focus on the the biochemical underpinnings of the substances with which design, that are available to design, and therefore that the expertise is around which design organizes itself, and therefore the professions and disciplines and scopes are organized around that, and therefore the ideas of a social imaginary, what we're going to, kinds of societies we're going to design, from some of the claims made by object-oriented ontology, and that, and Harman will agree on at least this point, in that there's an important distinction to be made philosophically and practically for design between matter and object, and where, again, the interest that we're proposing here is a focus on matter, whereas for Harman, it's about this conceptual encapsulation of different forms of matter as being an object that can be said based on some kind of sleight of hand to withdraw from one another in different kinds of ways. Our interest is less in terms of this kind of armchair philosophy than it is in beginning with a more, as I say, a kind of more disenchanted and demystified practical understanding of the capacities of matter at particular scales. You don't necessarily have to go to quarks and photons, molecules and DNA and cells with perfectly usable as a scale for us to understand. To understand the capacities of this, to re-ask the types of questions about fundamental abstraction that philosophy might have been good at a particular point through this more contemporary understanding of the capacities of matter, and to build up those a language of abstraction for philosophy anew from this development and this in this understanding. And so there's another point of, there's a longer point of argumentation to be made around this point as well. What I wanted to, though, I guess the distinction to be made, just to underscore the point as well, is, I mean, speculative realism is there's a lot of and as I think everyone I don't really consider myself to be part of the speculative realist camp, but those who are, some of which I find my work would be correspondent with in many ways, would agree that they all have very different ideas and opinions about how this works. How Graham Harman might think about neuroscience and how Ray Brassier, for example, might think about neurosciences are about as different as they could possibly be. For example, one of the things that what I'm sort of proposing here in terms of this shifting away from human-centered anthropometric notions of the temporality of a site condition or a spatial condition does nevertheless have strong correspondences with the kind of the claims that speculative realism has to shift the perspective of the human off-center or out of the center of the consideration as a sort of philosophical problematic. So for what Miyasu and then via Harman think of as correlationism, the notion from Kant that the human is the center of this operation, the human's capacities for the perception of the object is ultimately the starting point and ending point of the capacity for the knowledge of those things and so forth and so on. This via Miyasu, whose work I do quite like, is I think an important undermining of the kinds of to use the sort of more prosaic terms of the of certain kinds of anthropocentrisms within a continental philosophy. And in this regard, the kinds of speculative design that we're discussing here and those claims for that is one in which that the position and scale of the human as the starting point and ending point, and the logic of social history as the basis by which those temporalities would be understood, again, I think is correspondent to this. Now, there's a number of other limitations around this and distinctions that we may want to make as well. One of which is, I think, around this question of enchantment and disenchantment. Zizek recently, like just a few days ago, posted a rather weird commentary on the work of Levi Bryant, who's used to be someone that Harman worked with quite a bit, and they've sort of gone off in different directions to a certain point. Levi wrote a very interesting book called Democracy of Objects. And in this book, Zizek, I think, makes a point that is probably actually more a description of Timothy Morton's work than of Levi's work, in which he says that the point of object-oriented ontology is to rediscover a kind of enchantment of the world that modern forms of thinking had rendered asunder. The idea that there is a kind of magic relationship between objects that we can't possibly explain through rationality and reason, that we don't really ever have access to. And so that this displacement of the Kantian, so for this, and again, I think that describes what Morton is doing more than it describes what Levi is doing. But to the extent to which that's the case, and the extent to which that's a certain strand within speculative realism and new materialism more generally, and I suppose would represent a certain displacement of a certain kind of subject or reason, the direction that I'm really proposing is one that would be closer to what Ray Brassier and Ray Zinagar-Astani and this other sort of strand within speculative realism that are looking at, is that this displacement of the Kantian anthropic subject is accomplished not through, or the result of this displacement is not a mystical re-enchantment of a now re-magicked pre-modern world, but rather a further and more relentless and more comprehensive disenchantment of matter and the world and our relationship to it. It is predicated, I think, more on what I would call the Copernican traumas. That is, we understand that we're through Copernican astronomy that our planet is not the center of the universe, through Darwinian biology that species is not the central species, but rather part of a chemical continuum. And now with biotechnology, neuroscience, we begin to understand that even the last vestiges, the places where things like soul and magic and identity and thought and all those sort of last parts of the magical, immaterial, mystical world may have resided, are evacuated of some of their mystery, and we begin to realize that even the way we think about thinking is of itself not what we had presumed. And I think those kinds of Copernican traumas are always ones that are met with a great deal of social and cultural anxiety and enemy. And so I think arguably I would take that on the one end, that there's an impetus towards a kind of remystification of the world that perhaps some tendencies in object-oriented ontology are actually trying to enable, and whereas other tendencies within SR may be going in a completely opposite kind of direction. And so I just wanted to sort of make this sort of point. Okay, we're on time. All right, I'm going to skip some of the material stuff here because in a certain ways the crux of the remarks I wanted to make today in terms of our discussion, as well as some discussion of the project and the status of the project within. Okay, so here's your idea. So the idea is also not, you don't have to necessarily, it's not about leaving all these other sort of forms behind and to adding the nodes. You can add them together and in your design of your own practice, pick 3 and prosper. Get good at three of these options and organize the practice around that, and you're good to go. Biotech, interaction design, and robotics, good practice. Industrial design, Internet of Things, and architecture, good practice, right? Don't stick with just one, just reorganize together. Okay, now, other things to say around that that this question of speculation design has much to do with has as much to do with the conceptual technologies for destabilizing and setting up systems so that they can actually search the space of alternatives than it has to do with simply a mechanical facility. In other words, philosophy remains just as important, but as opposed to starting the question of philosophy from one of, here is the history of philosophy, this is what we know about objects from Hume, this is what Kant said, this is where Whitehead comes in, this is where Heidegger and equipment come in, and that's the means by which we're going to talk about things like 3D printing and synthetic biology. I suppose my interest in a way is sort of reversed. We want to go as deep into an understanding of these forms of material knowledge that are accessible to us, and from that knowledge build up the philosophical abstractions that we would actually be able to use, that we would want to use, and that would serve us in different sorts of ways. And to the extent to which we can then bring in this other history of what is essentially a kind of, for all practical purposes, a pre-modern philosophy, and by that I would categorize anything from before 1950. That's fine, and that gives a historical context. But for me, the issue of technology is not how do we fit this within a history of philosophy, but rather the other way around. Anyway, another point of distinction perhaps between Graham and Timothy and the rest. Okay, now, the project. How do we think about, what is the structure in the project within this relationship to speculation? Not just speculative design per se, but design and speculation as such. Okay, so Bruce Sterling, science fiction writer, has this nice line he says about design fictions. He says that what are design fictions? Design fictions are, and he puts it, the deliberate use of diegetic prototypes to suspend the disbelief about change. That is, they're projects that are made not because they're going to solve an immediate problem. Like, you don't build those pig wings or, here, let me show you this one. So I like this one a lot. Revitol Cohen's. This is a project, it's a phantom limb recorder. So you know the phantom limbs, you get your arm severed, and because of both in terms of the nerve cells are still often bundled in there, but because also cognitively the brain's map of the body is still thinks it has an arm in different sorts of ways. It's actually sort of structural map, sort of the inverse of the blind man and the cane who adds the cane to the body map. It's something's been subtracted and yet it still remains. And so people can have these occasionally very painful experiences in limbs that aren't actually there. So this is a project about trying to record those experiences where the person experiences this, it captures these things, but now, this is not real. Right? And this as well. This is a proposition around these kinds of questions, around this as well. And it has this, and we could do so if we had a little bit more time, a number of interesting questions about the empirical status of individual experience, about the instrumentation of these, about this relationship of the organism to the prosthetic, about the boundary points of the interior to interior, all kinds of interesting things by which we would get raised by it that would allow us to come to some of those other forms of philosophical abstraction that would be derived from the technical investigation as opposed to the other way around. But it's not about solving a problem. It's not about having GIs who lost limbs come in and get strapped up to this thing to solve the problem. There's a different function to the design there as well. It's a diegetic prototype in that it's something we're meant to sort of think of ourselves as experiencing in a particular way, such that that space of possibilities of what it is possible to do, how it is possible to, what kinds of systems might it be possible to make, what the relationship to this new material palette might be, as opposed to simply taking an older understanding, an older model for what they're good for and trying to apply it directly. The TV on radio, horseless carriage kind of model, setting up ways in which we can actually search that space of possibilities that might teach us something about what this stuff is actually good for. Okay, now. So now I think to Bruce's point, this is a useful way of thinking about this. Stuff. At the same time, we want to keep open the idea that the relationship between the model and the thing that the outcome that the model is provoking are not necessarily a one-to-one homology. It's not. So Czernyshek and Williams in their book Inventing the Future, and the Accelerationist Manifesto, and its versions of this, use this term they call the prefigurative. And they're talking about this in terms of politics, and the idea that if you wanted to have a certain kind of political outcome, the means by which you would realize that outcome has to be, in a way, a kind of exact miniature of the outcome you want. So if you want a more egalitarian, non-hierarchical, democratic part of the city, the committee for the organization needs to itself be relentlessly non-hierarchical and democratic and egalitarian. And if somehow the outcome by which the means that you would try to achieve this ends is unsuccessful, it's probably because you haven't purified that means enough. You see this rationale of it trying to sort of making trying to develop, try to guarantee a certain kind of political organizational outcome by essentially trying to pre-model or prefigure that outcome in the miniature. I think one of the distinctions we want to make a little bit from the way Bruce puts this is that the logic of the prefigurative, or the logic of the prototype, is not the same as the prefigurative. Just like Alexander Graham Bell's kite can turn into 4chan, the nonlinearity and the ambiguity of the cause and effect is something we want to hold on to as being is not something that needs to be purified out of the equation, but as the basis by which any of this works in the first place. And we'll come back to this question of that ambiguity sort of in a moment here as well. Now, this also goes to this idea of the necessity for design theory to be working from a direct engagement with the material capacities for composition, as opposed to those material capacities to be operating in the image of a history of philosophy. That is because, as I would put it, our emerging technologies are emerging faster than our theoretical and conceptual responses and framing and strategies for them. Our ability to do things is probably always, I think any kind of modernity has a certain form of enemy in this regard. But at the moment is that the more pressing issue is the invention of the developments and the capacities for these framing strategies. I try to make the case at the research university, UCSD, where I'm at, which spends a huge amount of money on the amazing science and engineering programs that are inventing all kinds of things that we don't quite yet know what to do with. And the development of the strategies and the framing of these technologies is really the more important question. That is, or another way of putting it, our current way of thinking is both what makes these technologies possible and is also what prevents them from reaching their full capacity for social good and transformation. And so a kind of corresponding investment in means and strategy rebalancing the investment in means and strategy is probably the efficient path. Now, to this question of theory and the philosophy question of things, I don't want to, by saying that we want to first start with this question of a focus on the technical affordances of the compositional affordances of the new forms of matter, this doesn't mean that somehow the philosophical questions are put to the side. I think quite the opposite. The emerging technologies and this emerging material palette is interesting to the extent, as I say, that they disenchant and demystify something about our world and our species and ourselves within that world, that they actually, that working with them in a certain way, understanding, not just discovering DNA and discovering that there's a basic for amino acid structures that result in all these different kinds of carbon-based life forms. And this is a discovery, but of actually working through the conceptual philosophical abstractions and implications of such a thing. For example, that this is in fact where those new forms of theoretical insight come from. For the design practice, these things are interesting to the extent to which they allow for a remaking of the world at a much more granular level, not just at the anthropometric scale, the object of a brick on top of a brick, but of the molecules and atoms of which bricks work, and all of the transcontinental and ecological and climatic scales by which those accumulations and assemblages also interact. Both of these are at work at once. Now, part of this question of the ambivalence of that we spoke to, and the ambivalence of this, is part of why we want to defend the ambiguity within the project, is that the technologies with which we're working on themselves are, in and of themselves, what Socrates called pharmakon, as I think I've mentioned sort of a few times in the dialogues. So Socrates tells Plato we need to be suspicious of this writing stuff because it's kind of this new media called writing. People can write things down. You can't interrogate them in person. You could read things that dead people wrote. It's kind of disgusting. It's all that's the thing. We need to be highly suspicious of this. And he basically said that a technology such as writing that is this powerful is inevitably both remedy and poison. It has both the capacity to cure and to make sick at the same time. It's not that it's one or the other, that it's remedy or poison, but that it's both. It's always both. And that any of the perspectives that we might hear or learn or positions we might hold about any of the technologies that comprise this emergent material palette, biotech, nanotech, robotics, AI, 3D printing, whatever you want, any perspective that would suggest that it can be remedy without being poison, or that it is inevitably poison without also being a remedy, is probably an incomplete or dishonest assessment. And it's because of this ambiguous quality, this ambivalent status of the materials themselves, that the projects, again, as I'll say, want to remain themselves a bit ambiguous. Now, another way of saying the same thing, depending on the metaphor that you prefer, is that these emerging technologies are a bit like stem cells. They could grow, they could become this, they could become that. We don't know what this stuff is good for yet. And that's the interesting part. And because of that, it's unwise, I think, and probably even unethical to decide that and to conclude that the early manifestations of a particular technology, ones that we might find to be suspicious or pernicious, like drones, which from another perspective are just flying cameras, or something else you want to pick that seems to be a sort of a good thing in the early phases, that somehow the early manifestations of those technologies represent their essential character potential. I think to do so is to give up way too much in a way in which that, at least from a designer's perspective, is probably an unethical abdication. We don't know what they're good for yet, and so we need to keep that search space of possibilities open for as long as possible. And again, going back to this A-B search at the beginning. Sometimes those search spaces are ones that we have deliberate authorship over, and sometimes they're forms of experimentation and alternative mapping of alternatives that are more automated. The other thing I think it's important to keep in mind, also especially given the kind of design bent that an institution like this has, is that in many cases, and especially when we sort of think about, well, we don't have access to these laboratories, we can't do this stuff, we just draw pictures of buildings. Art can do things that science is not allowed to do in many cases. And one of the interesting things that I've seen is, there's a lot of cases of this from in the sort of heyday of bioart from the 1990s. Everybody familiar with the Milgram experiment? Do you know the Stanley Milgram experiment on acquiescence to authority? You probably know this as well. So this is famous social psychology experiment from the late 50s, early 60s. Put these people in a laboratory. The guy in the white lab coat says, you must administer an electroshock to this person because it's part of the experiment we're doing here. And of course, this person, they're not actually administering an electric shock. They think they are. And what they're testing is how far will the person go to doing what they thinking they're giving someone an electric shock if the person in authority tells them that they have to continue. So what they're really testing is how acquiescent people are to certain forms of authority. It was a hugely famous experiment within social psychology. Now, you could never in a million years get anything like that through a human subjects research trial committee within a university. But you can do it in art, but you can do it in the context of art. It was restaged a few years ago in a gallery in Glasgow, for example. A couple weeks ago, I was in Berlin for a Transmediale and was a panel with Jacob Appelbaum and Trevor Paglen, who developed this. Jacob Appelbaum is one of the guys who was key figures in the Tor project. They built this thing called an autonomy cube, which is basically like this massive Tor node that anonymizes web traffic going through it one way or another. And it's been shown in a number of different museums and galleries. Usually, the police get very interested in what the hell this thing is and what's going on around it, and it's just basically this sort of Hans Hacke clear cube. And if this object had been across the street in a cafe or in someone's apartment, it may have been confiscated by the police. But once it's put in the gallery, it has a kind of immunity from prosecution, because in the gallery this is a space of mimesis. It's not sort of the world itself. There's an artist who's now visiting at the Scripps Research Institute in Oceanography down in La Jolla, where I'm at, one of the things that she's very interested in is in cloud making and cloud measurement and cloud tracing, and the forms of water and the organisms that live in clouds, and the whole sort of biology and biodiversity of clouds, and around this as well, particularly around questions of geoengineering at different scales, and where the boundary between what's geoengineering and different. I mean, every time you drive your car and you put CO2 out, you're geoengineering a little bit. Well, where does this start and stop? But any kind of there's a lot of hard and soft moratorium on more substantive, deliberate scientific research in geoengineering for changing cloud albedo and sort of things like this as well. But if it's done under the auspices of art, if it's not science, if it's just art, it's okay, you can get away with this. And so she's collaborating with a number of scientists at SIO who can't really do that kind of work, but she's allowed to do it because she's an artist. The point of which is to say is that in that space, that space of disciplinary permissions, that things that art and design are allowed to do that science and engineering are not allowed to do, it may in fact be the exact same thing. But because you have there's a way that you can strategize this arbitrage of permissions that the disciplinary alibi gives you. You're extraordinarily well positioned to search that space of alternatives for this material palette in ways that laboratories simply, and those within the scientific discipline with certain responsibilities to produce certain kinds of data, simply cannot. Sort of winding up here. Again, as I've said, I think in our last discussion, ambiguity, abstraction, and ambivalence are probably the sign of successful design research. As I've suggested for our discussions of the speculative megastructure, the megastructural narratives that you're developing, the way in which we want to structure these and the kind of balance I ask you to sort of strike is between is across these at least two balances. On the one hand, there shouldn't be a certain sense of like, is this real or not? We're not quite sure if this in fact is a real story or not. There should be some level of peculiarity. If we're quite sure it's one or the other, it might not be so interesting. The question, the being able to game the ontology of the narrative and the projection itself is part of a strategy. But perhaps the most important one also in terms of the ambiguity and ambivalence and using that pharmacological logic of these technologies to your advantages is this ethical. If your project is such that we would take it to be an extraordinarily interesting and provocative and important thing should this actually come to pass, but we're not quite sure whether that would be the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world should this come to pass, it's probably an interesting path for design research, way or another. It's something that you should sort of follow up on. If we already know whether or not your project would be a good thing or a bad thing, it's not really research. It's just, there's nothing new, there's nothing essentially new to be discovered. And that doesn't mean all design has to be new, but for it to be new, it probably has to be undecidable to a certain degree. Okay, so then lastly, just to sort of more to this point on the future and this as well, and this question of the temporal duration by which we sort of work as well. One of my favorite, okay, what I mean is we're not talking about this sort of future. As I say, in our culture, speaking about the future is a way of saying things that otherwise wouldn't be said, but it's also a way of saying nothing at all. In the future, interfaces will be slightly more delightful. This is a sad plan for the future of our species, I think. All right. So we are here, blue dot, this as well. One of my, I still think the most interesting, it's well known, but I still think it's a very interesting speculative design brief. The work that came out of it wasn't necessarily the most interesting, but as a brief, it's a quite interesting one, was a design competition with the Department of Energy for signage at the proposed Yucca Mountain nuclear waste disposal site in New Mexico. You familiar with this? So Yucca Mountain, so it was a place where it's a salt mines, it's a salt cavities deep underground. It makes a lot of sense. It's a good place to put nuclear waste, but for various reasons, it hasn't worked out the way it was originally planned. The competition was to design, as you probably know, was to design signage for the site such that 10,000 years in the future, should somebody or something decide to dig here, all right, I'm going to come back to this as well, decide to dig there. I want to find the exact picture. Decide to dig there, that they would know not to do so. And I think Ridley Scott's Prometheus had its own solution to this problem, and the part of the sort of story where they go into this place, and they had holograms of people screaming and running the other direction from where you would walk in. That was sort of the universal symbol of don't go there, is your encounter, is you've got holograms of people screaming away from the other sort of places as well. But the project for this was to, what kinds of signage would have to go here that would dissuade people or aliens or who knows, from 10,000 years in the future from digging here. And part of the reason I find this such an interesting kind of design brief is because it requires, in order to come up with any kind of solution, a plausible, valid solution, it requires a designer to really stretch the boundaries of their speculative capacities to limit, to imagine to imagine forms of possibilities that are totally outside and alien of the sort of normative, cultural normative ways in which that thing might be solved today within a particular context, and to be as imaginative as possible in doing so. It's not something, it's a kind of solution that an artist or designer is well suited to providing because of that capacity for imagination. At the same time, this is a very practical problem. And the kinds of models that we would, the kinds of ways in which you might decide or solve that problem in terms of what are forms of universal signification, what would actually last this long, what would indicate or symbolize some sort of form of danger, what would precede this. These are also relentlessly practical, not at all airy-fairy kinds of considerations. And in fact, what's of interest then, it's precisely because any kind of viable solution to this must be deeply, deeply, relentlessly practical, totally demystified of any kinds of prejudices or presumptions about these ways of work, that it's therefore able to be so wildly imaginative and speculative, because it requires us to essentially go beyond, to be alienated from the logical, sort of the normative solution, it becomes possible for, in this most practical way, it becomes possible for the speculation and imagination to take place. It's an example of sort of why in which we argue that it's the demystification and disenchantment of the relationship to these systems and to the material operations of these systems through a temporal, spatial, and material conceptions of what the scales, which is sort of, is not the means by which speculation and imagination gets shut down. It's in fact how it actually gets opened up. In the exact same way that once we sort out that geocentric cosmology is not as accurate as heliocentric cosmology, this makes possible images as stupefyingly beautiful as the Hubble Deep Space image, a far more beautiful image than we could possibly have managed if we kept hold to Ptolemaic cosmology. It's the disenchantment and demystification is what enables the real speculative and imaginative work to actually take place. Here's this Copernican trauma in this as well. Okay, so I guess the question is, this question sort of coming back to the beginning of the site condition here as well is then, right, given this material palette with which they're working, what if we dealt with, and this matrix of the spatial and temporal scale, what if we dealt with lots of other kinds of design problems, not just nuclear waste disposal, but lots of other kinds of design problems with the same kind of, with the same attention to non-anthropometric temporal and spatial durations? What would a human AI interaction design look like if you're thinking about it in terms of a 1 year, 10 year, 100 years, 1,000 years, or 10,000 year duration? The way we would think about the design of human AI interaction for a 10,000 year project is different than the way you would design it in terms of whether you use Morgan Freeman's voice on Waze or not. It's a different way of structuring the design question as well. What does multi-generational housing look like if you're thinking about it over the span of 130 human generations, which is about what 10,000 years is? Or transnational urbanism. In San Diego and Tijuana, we have this one city that's bisected by an international border. It creates all kinds of weird kinds of things around this line. What other, from a sovereign geography, what do you do with archived medical data, or how do you think about things like data privacy and data and have access to the research, who does the research, what you use it for, if you're thinking about it in terms of the same kind of 130 generation, in terms of generation arcs, and why aren't we dealing with that question in that way now? Why aren't we thinking about things, the kinds of social and cultural identities that we develop in the way in which that biology is not just something that's recomposed at a molecular level, but something that's performed at a social, cultural, and identitarian level? We think about those kinds of design transformations in terms of these transgenerational arcs. Other kinds of things come to light. They become available. They become part of the speculation or biology, interspecies communication, whatever. We would do better, I would argue, on almost any kind of design challenge which we just sort of look at if we begin with the presumption of this what do we call it, trans-anthropometric temporalities for the site conditions, but what to do for it. But in order to do so, we first have to have it that matrix as part of the operation, and to take the encounter with this emergent material palette as one that is not just about how can we use these things to solve the most immediate problems that we might sort of have, the most pedestrian kinds of older and stale problems, but what kinds of opportunities that they actually allow for, how do they force us to rethink the world, ourselves and a relationship into the world in new kinds of ways, and how does that doing so reframe the question of these kinds of durations in ways in which we might actually have some semblance of a chance of building our way out of the Anthropocene. I don't argue that if we don't, we won't. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thanks very much. So we're okay on time, I think. We went a little longer than an hour, didn't we? It's okay. What's that? Yeah, so I went about 80% longer than I was going to do, so that's so fine as well. But thank you for this as well. We can pick up some of the questions and discussions of all of this. Why don't we take a couple questions if we have any with this as well? We can say till 3 or something like this, if you've all been very patient. I don't want to sort of, I'm happy to take questions, but also at the same time, I don't want to keep you here if you don't want to say. Are there other thoughts we want to discuss now, or we can hold on? Whatever. All right, we can chew on them for a few minutes, and then we'll come back for the seminar. And then we'll spit them out. All right, thanks, everyone.